So hi everyone. Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you. Again, my name is Reid, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience in computer science, my experience as a cybersecurity engineer, how I got into computer science in the first place, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit about how I kind of made a career move over to an organization called Girls Who Code, which is where I currently work. But like I said, I'm going to keep it fairly short. I don't want to go into too much detail so that I can hear your guys' questions and hear what you want to hear more about. A little bit about me to start with. I went to school called Tufts University, where I majored in mathematics and minored in computer science. I like to show a couple of these photos because a lot of times when people think about majoring in these like STEM disciplines, we call them, it feels a little bit one note. And one of the things that I hope you guys will take away from this experience is that I believe that you can go into computer science and go into math or go into engineering and have a lot of different interests. So when I was at Tufts, just school right outside of Boston, I had a lot of other interests. I went abroad in Spain, that's me on a camel in Morocco when I was abroad, and I sang in a gospel choir. So I had a lot of interests outside of these STEM disciplines. But I had never taken computer science before college. And I went to a school much like Claire that had a great computer science department, had some great courses, and I was taking like AP math and physics, but I never even considered taking computer science. I didn't even really know that it was an option. I didn't know what it was about. So I ended up taking a computer science course as part of the math major. So one of the requirements of the math major at Tufts is to take at least one computer science course. So I took it, and it was like CS 101, and I thought it sounded interesting, but I really didn't know anything about it. And what I found was that I really liked it, but I really felt like an outsider in the class. I was one of maybe 2 girls in a class of like 25, which is about, an average number, a little bit below average. And I had never coded before, and it seemed like a lot of people in the class had been programming at home for years. And I was paired with a lab partner who had been coding at home for years, and certainly made me know that he didn't think I knew as much as he did. But what I found was he had probably been hacking at home for years and was finally in college, and people cared that he had this experience. So he was like a little overexcited about using a lot of technical terminology. But for me, it made me feel like I'm not sure if this is something that I can do. I'm not sure if this is for me. And I kind of kept debating about whether this is or not this is something I should go into. But eventually I stuck with it, and because I found I really loved it. Mostly through the mentorship of some of the other women in my department, which is why I got really interested in this question of the gender gap in tech and why there were so few girls in my classes. So at the end of Tufts, I ended up with a minor in computer science and a major in math. After that, I went to go work as a cybersecurity engineer at an organization called the MITRE Corporation. So MITRE runs federally funded research and development centers. What does that mean? Basically, it means that we would do research and engineering work for government organizations, primarily the Department of Defense as well as the NSA. So I'll be able to answer some questions. I can't answer all of them because some of the stuff that I did was actually secret. So I can't share all of the information. But what I can tell you is that I worked on some really interesting projects when I was at MITRE. So actually, these are 2 of the organizations I worked for. We did some work for NATO. So I got to work on some international projects that were basically funded through Department of Defense. So I got to go work in Estonia and The Hague, and it was really super cool. And then we also did some work for the Department of Defense. The reason why I really loved working for MITRE was that we were working for a range of these agencies, and they all had different problems that they're trying to solve. So you really get a good flavor of a lot of different kinds of projects. I worked on some things that were really pure research to really applied engineering, and a lot of really smart people. One of the reasons why I think cybersecurity especially is really interesting and important is that it's always changing. And the technology is constantly changing, so the security mechanisms that we use to protect that technology are also constantly changing. Especially in the work that we would do for government work, you're basically trying to protect systems from external hackers, which are primarily what we call nation-state actors. So hackers from other countries that have their government's funding that are trying to hack into American systems. And I should say that what we did at MITRE was completely defensive, so I only know about what we were doing to try to protect our systems. We know from some things that have come out that we are certainly doing this offensively too, but I don't know about any of that. So, so I don't mean to say that we're not doing it also. We are. So one of the reasons why I think it's such a fascinating field is that basically what you need to keep doing is figuring out how do I protect the technologies from these various hackers and trying to learn about what their methods are so that you can protect against them. So it's a little bit of an arms race in a way, but I think that's what makes it very exciting and fascinating is that you're constantly learning new material and constantly trying to find new ways to protect. And I was talking with some of the folks at dinner earlier about why this is so important. And we live in an increasingly technical world. I'm a little bit older than you guys, but not by a lot. I remember when I needed to use an encyclopedia to look things up, and I couldn't use Google. Everything that we do now is connected. You know, you wake up with your phone. Your cars are connected to the internet. Everything that we do is connected in some way. And I think that's a wonderful thing, but it does mean we need to take the security really seriously because that means we're becoming increasingly dependent on this technology. So I really loved working at MITRE. I was there for 4 years. It's a really fascinating place. As I mentioned, I minored in computer science, and so I was getting more and more technical during my time at MITRE. I tried taking classes at night so that I could learn a little bit more. I was working towards my master's. If anyone here, any of the teachers here have done that, it is really, really hard to work full-time and go to grad school at night, so I decided to go to grad school full-time. And so that was when I ended up at Columbia University in New York. So I went to Columbia for my master's. Actually, I was thinking about pursuing a PhD and decided that a master's was enough for me, personally, at this point. But one of the main things that I learned at Columbia was all of the different areas that a couple of the different areas that computer science was involved in that I hadn't gotten a chance to study yet. So I primarily focused on something called natural language processing and machine learning. So natural language processing is basically about how we kind of take linguistics and combine it with computer science. So a lot of the research in natural language processing is what fuels like Siri on your phone. Basically being able to understand what you say and make sense of that, crunch data, and say something back to you that makes sense. So there's a lot of really, really fascinating work in computational linguistics and natural language processing. I also did a lot of work involved in that in machine learning and data science. So basically, machine learning is kind of what I would usually call statistics on steroids. It's basically the computationally driven version of statistics, and it's used in companies everywhere. Basically, you know, when people talk about big data, machine learning is like really what companies are doing with all of that data. So what we would work on is basically how to predict information from data. So that's something, though these are two areas actually that I touched on in some of my work in cybersecurity. So for natural language processing, for example, you can look at text data or look at comments. So there are some hacking groups that actually talk to each other in kind of coded messages via internet comment conversations. So they have very covert ways of trying to exchange information with each other so that they won't get caught. So one of the things that we would do is kind of scan this data and scan this information for ways that to try to figure out what some of those hackers might be saying. So there are some really interesting and unexpected ways that these subjects kind of combine. But when I was at Columbia, what I was really getting interested in was education specifically, and that was why I had been considering going for a PhD. My father's a professor, and I had always thought that I would want to be involved in education in some way, so I thought that was how I wanted to do it. But when I was at Columbia, I got involved with the Teachers College there, which does their education graduate work. And I worked in a lab that was developing curriculum and computer science education. And I was really passionate about this because, as I said, I think that this work, having a lot of really smart people involved in computer science, and especially people who are going to be able to be diverse thinkers and come from different backgrounds and have new ideas, is extremely important. I would see, even if you have the best group of well-intentioned people, if you have a pretty homogeneous group who's designing a product, the product isn't as good. And there's a lot of research that shows this, that diverse groups make better decisions and make better products. And I saw that in my experience. So I was really interested in, how do we change computer science education in a way that gets more people involved who maybe have traditionally not been very involved. So I decided that I wanted to spend the summer teaching computer science, and literally the next day I saw an ad for Girls Who Code. So I fell in love with education, and I found an organization called Girls Who Code. This is my Girls Who Code classroom, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our programs at the organization. But I taught in Miami. These are all girls who had never coded before the summer. By the end of the summer, you can see that's you can't see it too well, but that's kind of our mad genius coding wall that we it's just code that's covering the entire wall there. And basically, by the end of the summer, the girls learn they can program mobile apps, they can program robots, they could do a lot more than I knew. It took me several semesters to get the expertise that they had. So I really fell in love with Girls Who Code. I believe that computer scientists at their core are problem solvers and are looking for problems and trying to figure out what the solutions are to those problems. And the problem that I had become most interested in at this point was, what is the deal with the gender gap in tech? Why are there so few women involved in this? Why has it gone in the wrong direction, which it actually has since the 1980s? And I felt like Girls Who Code was the solution. So I joined Girls Who Code full-time just a little over 2 years ago after I finished my master's at Columbia. So I just want to tell you a little bit about this problem and why we think it's a problem. So, as I mentioned earlier, there were more women computer scientists in the 1980s. So in 1984, about 37% of computer science majors were women. Today that number hovers somewhere between 12 and 18%, depending on which report you see. So what does this look like? We often you might hear people talking a lot about gender in STEM and what that means. That actually really annoys me, and I'll tell you why. It's because not all STEM disciplines have this gender issue. So if you see the AP tests, this was from 2011, so these numbers have changed a little bit in the last couple of years, but they're still pretty close. There are a lot of areas where in high school it's almost 50-50, but computer science hovers around 19% of women were taking the computer science exam. So, okay, so in high school, you have fewer girls taking computer science. Then what happens? This graph in the middle from UCLA is a measure of the number of women involved in computer science as their college major compared with men. And what's interesting is you can see in the 80s there's this spike that both men and women are involved in. And in the 90s, there's a spike and there's this little bump for women. So the two things that happened there, and why there were spikes at all, was that the 80s, that's when basically the personal computer came out, and computers were no longer something that was just for businesses. And then in the 90s, that's like the World Wide Web and the internet. And then we're seeing kind of a spike again now in just like mobile, and there's, in Silicon Valley, there's this, huge economic growth. So there are a couple different, I often get asked, like, why did that happen? That's something I think a lot of people are still trying to answer. There's a really fantastic story that NPR did about this, where they basically, their reasoning for it is on like ads and culture. So when those personal computers were coming out in the mid-80s, all of the advertising around it was aimed at young boys, and it was talking about the computer as a toy. And so there's some research that showed that basically if you had a computer in your home, a lot of times it would end up in the boys' room and not in the girls' room. So then, those kids grow up, and you have more boys who are interested in computers because they kind of were playing around with them from the beginning, and fewer girls who think that it's really something for them or think that it's something that girls can do. This tends to be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you get fewer women involved in computer science. There are fewer role models. Fewer younger girls think to go into it. And so that's why I got really interested in this problem. A couple of years ago, a lot of the big tech companies got some pressure to release their diversity data. So this is some of Google's numbers. So you can see that Google, for example, is 30% women overall. The tech section, the folks who are actually doing the technical work at Google, is way less, it's 17%. And then this is also a huge issue from a race and ethnicity standpoint as well. Some of these numbers here for Google are really, really small. And so it's interesting. I think that tech companies have an obligation to try to do a better job, especially by having more role models and making sure that their hiring practices are fair. But it's also not totally their fault. If there's not enough girls getting involved in this in high school and there aren't enough women involved in this in college, they don't have anyone to hire. So this is when people refer to the pipeline problem, which is something you might have heard, this is what they're talking about. So why does this matter? Well, there's a lot of reasons why it matters. As I mentioned, I think that diverse teams create better products, and so that's why it's extremely important to me personally. But the other reason is that there are going to be a lot of unfilled jobs in computer science, and we need everyone. So the numbers right now are that by about 2020, there'll be 1.4 million open jobs in computer science, and only basically about 1 million of those jobs will probably be unfilled at this rate. So it's not just a matter of, it's not as though there are going to be a limited number of jobs and men and women are going to be duking it out. We don't have enough people to fill it, period. So we need the men who are studying computer science to continue studying it, and we need a lot more women to get involved if we're going to fill these jobs. So I think this is really interesting and important. To me, it shows that this is something that we all really need to deeply be involved in and really kind of hustle, because these are really amazing jobs. There's lots of interesting work in computer science. I was asked by one of the, sorry, I forget your name. What's your name? Sorry to call you out, Danny. Danny asked me at dinner about, during Rex Tillerson's confirmation hearing, someone was asking, Marco Rubio asked about whether there needs to be kind of essentially like a technical process, a technical version of like a war criminal. Like, what does that mean if you've hacked another country? What are the repercussions? And I think these are really interesting questions that we don't have the answers to yet, because there aren't a lot of people who are able to understand both the law and the international relations piece and the politics piece and the technology. So privacy laws in the United States, for example, they don't keep pace because the technology changes a lot more quickly than the laws can. So, my point is that these things are not one note. It's really amazing if you're thinking to yourself, oh, how am I going to decide between political science and computer science as my majors in college? I think it's best that you do both of those, because we need people who understand the technology and have diverse interests for how it can be applied elsewhere, because we just don't have enough people who understand both sides and can help create solutions to these problems. So these are just a couple photos from our programs at Girls Who Code. We have two main programs. We have an after-school clubs program and a summer immersion program. The clubs program is for girls 6th through 12th grade. Girls Who Code, by the way, started in 2012 with one summer immersion program. And the next summer we had 9 immersion programs and I think like a pilot of about 100 clubs. Today we have almost 1,200 clubs in all 50 states, and we will be running about 75 to 80 summer immersion programs this year. So we've grown really rapidly. I was kind of well suited when I started at Girls Who Code, because we're a nonprofit, so we kind of operate like a tech startup. So when I came in, I was the only person doing curriculum, and I built a team, and I now managed a team of like 7 people. So these are just a couple of fun photos. I was visiting some clubs and so took some selfies. We do During our summer immersion program, we do workshops and field trips, and students get to see how computer science is being used in different ways in their community. This is just one of the programs that the girls do. We call it like Obamification. So basically they write a program that will change the pixels in an image to those photos from like Obama's 2008 campaign photo. And once they learn that, you can change the colors, and so we had people changing it to the colors of their favorite soccer team. And so everything that we do is very project-based. We like to do things where you can learn the computer science and use it in a creative way. So that is, okay, yeah, that was just about 20 minutes. So that's my story. I'm happy to go into more detail, but I wanted to keep it kind of short so that I can hear questions from you guys. Okay. Can you also hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'll just keep doing this. So I'd like to just open it up now to any questions that you guys have about security or computer science or girls in code or whatever. I'll start with you.
What was the biggest project you worked on?
At MITRE or at anywhere?
Anywhere.
The biggest project I worked on, probably it was the project that I did for NATO when I was at MITRE, which I can talk about a little bit. So basically what we were doing was trying to create systems that would help people better exchange cybersecurity threat information. So basically what happens to a lot of companies and government agencies is that it can be a threat to them to divulge like how they've been hacked, because this can like release some sensitive information, and for companies especially, it's a little dangerous because they're worried about their profits going down if they say that they've been hacked. But what's interesting is that it's happening to a lot of people, and it's like a secret that everyone's keeping, and they would actually be a lot better suited if they shared that information because it's easier for us to find solutions. So basically what we were developing was kind of a secure way and partnerships for them to exchange that information with each other, and make that itself very secure, so that it wouldn't be seen by the hackers who perpetrated the attacks in the first place. And that was huge. When you said like it was like a really big project, it was really big because it took a lot of time, and like when you're dealing with different government agencies and companies, they're all handling their information really differently. So it was really difficult to try to create a system that would that works for everyone. How about another question? Yes, you in the best.
So you said you work for the government, and in order to protect the people from terrorists and hackers, you said you need to scan the internet.
Yeah.
In the process of scanning the internet, I believe there must be some privacy issues as a people who work for the government is supposed to know.
Yeah, so I completely agree. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons why I left was I wasn't that happy with some of the things that I was seeing happening. And I took a privacy seminar when I was at Columbia, and that was very fascinating because that was where you could really see that the laws around privacy were not keeping up with the technology itself. So I completely agree. I think it's really important that, I think there are two problems. One is that the companies themselves that are collecting a lot of that information, so the government's scanning for information, so is Facebook, Twitter, Google, everything that we use. And they have a lot of that information too. Some would argue that they actually may have more than the government has. I can't speak to whether or not that's exactly true, but I could see both. I could see it happening both ways. So I think that the companies and the government needs to be held more accountable. I think that like basically what Edward Snowden released, that was like right around when I left. I remember that report came out like in my last couple of weeks before I left for my master's program. And so there were things in that like I didn't even know, even though I was doing some of that work. So, it's something that like even a lot of government employees didn't know how deep some of those things went. So I think that's like the way he released it and things like that could be debated, but I think the overall effect of it was really important. For people to better understand what was happening and have better checks and balances in that system. I think that private companies need to be held more accountable to how they're gathering data. One of my assignments for that privacy course was to actually read those privacy agreements for Amazon and Google and Facebook and those things that you always click through, just oh yeah, okay, to actually read it. And then I like shut down like half of my accounts after reading them. So I recommend reading them to at least know what you're getting yourselves into. But I also think like the public has to think differently about it too, because I mean, especially for when you're growing up with the internet and everything that you guys do now, like I'm grateful that like a lot of this stuff didn't exist when I was in high school. So I'm sorry that you're gonna have your whole lives documented in some way. I think it's important for people to remember that when it's on the internet, it can live forever. Europe privacy law has done some interesting things thinking about, like, they have this idea called like the right to be forgotten. So the idea that like citizens should be able to let companies know, I want you to forget my data and delete it, and that like that's an actual right that they have. But you know, where that's going there is still up, you know, hasn't really been settled either. So I think it's extremely important, and I think that that the public and private companies and the government all need to do a bit of a better job. Yeah, there are a couple of you, so we'll just go zigzag down. Sure.
What's the biggest piece of advice that you could give to girls who want to pursue a career in STEM?
Yeah, the biggest piece of advice I'm going to cheat and give you two.
Okay.
And I actually think this is kind of true for anyone. But the two pieces of advice that I'll give you are, first, to have a lot of confidence in yourself. When I was in that class, I almost dropped it because I really felt like this wasn't something that I could do, just because I didn't get the lingo that a lot of the other people in my class had. So I didn't have a lot of confidence that I could do it, and it took me a long time to gain that confidence. And I really almost dropped several times because of that, not because I didn't like the work, but because I didn't think that like I was going to be able to do it. And if I had done that, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you about all this cool stuff. So the first is to try to have more confidence in yourself. And the second one is to try to have a role model or a mentor in some way. And again, I think this is like honestly general advice. That having a mentor is extremely important because you'll kind of go through these moments in your career path when you're not sure what to do, or you're making decisions about this internship or this job offer, or actually when I was applying to jobs, I was applying to a lot of different things, and I was lucky that I ended up in a job that I really loved. But having a mentor is extremely important in just kind of pushing you through some of those tougher moments, and being able to get a sense of their own real world experience. You know, you can't get that just from researching it online. So, yes, you. Yes, you. Yeah.
I mean, it's safe to say that technology is becoming more prevalent every day, and like in everyone's everyday lives. Like you said, it's now in their cars, and soon everything's going to be controlled by technology.
Yeah.
But with that, I mean, it seems like we become more vulnerable to like risks from hacks and stuff like that. So the question is, do you think it's worth the risk of just integrating more and more technology into our daily lives before we really crack down on those hackers and stuff like that? Because they still happen. Like you see it in the news all the time, these hackers. So before everything starts to become controlled by technology, I think it's smart to be able to just really crack down on the hackers.
The security part first. Yeah. That's a really good question. I think it would be a good idea. I think it would be a good idea to be like, okay, let's figure the security stuff out first before we do more. Unfortunately, I think it's unrealistic for it to unfold that way because there's just not like kind of one single place where we can control and say like, we're going to pause right now. I think what I would hope, I think this solution hopefully is for people or for organizations, basically for government agencies that are doing this work and for companies that are doing this work, for them to really try to prioritize security as they're building products or technologies, whatever it is that they're making. Because basically, if you prioritize security from the beginning, you're a lot less likely to be vulnerable to these hacks. The reason why this doesn't happen is because they're so, especially a lot of like the Silicon Valley startups and stuff, they're under a lot of pressure from their investors to get products out really quickly. And when that's happening, security is kind of one of the things that just falls by the wayside, and it's like, oh, we'll figure that out later. So my hope is that there will kind of be a change in mentality around this and trying to integrate security from the beginning. because I think, unfortunately, I don't think that we can like slow it down. For better or for worse, like a lot of the attacks that have been in the news lately and in like the last couple of years have given a little bit more, really showed that like what can go wrong. And so I think that people are starting to take it more seriously. But it's interesting, like the DIN attacks, which some people may remember, basically they were the DNS servers that were brought down when you couldn't, there were months when you like couldn't reach Netflix or not, this was months ago, but there were like a few hours or like it was like a day or two where you like, couldn't get to Netflix, you couldn't get to NewYorkTimes.com, you couldn't get to anything. And basically it wasn't that those sites were down, it was that your way to get to them went down. And what they used was Internet of Things devices. So you have connections on like the projector, you have connections on printers, on Nest cams, on like Apple TVs. And basically what hackers were able to do was put malware on each of those devices and use them to attack these servers and overwhelm them. And people are like, oh my, like I saw things, I saw articles that said, security researchers have been like warning about this for years, and I was like, yeah, I know, I was one of them. Like when we were at MITRE, people were talking about this all the time. And finally, something really big happened that caused a lot of people to freak out because they couldn't get to Netflix, and that's the worst thing. So it's funny, like we laugh, but it's kind of true. It's kind of true because it affected the general public rather than just one company, like just Target losing information. So I think that like a lot of these things are kind of helping companies and people to realize that they need to prioritize it. So I think the solution is trying to build it in from the beginning. In the blue shirt.
When it comes to cybersecurity, these government subcontractors and companies, they're looking for people who really know their skills, know their cryptography, know their security.
Yeah.
And they're not looking for any script kidding off the street.
Yes.
So why is it that? And this is true that there are a lot of the male population in cybersecurity just enormous compared to female. Why is it that males are more likely to be in front of the terminal or computer for 12 hours to 16 hours a day, honing their skills, and girls aren't? Is that something to do with the media and how they portray actors, or what is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think so a couple things. One is that I think that what you're talking about, that like the kind of hacker who's just in front of the computer for hours and hours on end.
I mean, those people also end up to be cybersecurity specialists.
Right.
Right.
Right. So I think, but I think it's frankly a little bit of a stereotype, and it's not how like all of the people who work in this field.
But anybody who's good, I mean, they spend a fair amount of time on their computer. I mean,
yes. Yeah. Definitely more than average.
Yeah.
But I think that like, so your question is why?
Why is it that females can't be doing that, or why is it that less females do that? Why?
So one of the reasons that I described in like that sort of 80s dip is that the way that computers have been marketed in the past and kind of continue to be marketed. I think there's a lot of things that our culture says about like what boys can do and what girls can do that are kind of not good for either gender. So I think that there aren't a lot of like role models for those people. But frankly, a lot of the people that I work with at MITRE who are some of like the greatest minds in computer science do have diverse interests and aren't necessarily in front of the computer for 16 hours a day. So while I think that some of the people that I know who do that are incredibly good, not all of the best computer scientists are doing that. So I think that the idea that you need to do that in order to be successful in this field is a little bit flawed. It's not that there are a lot of people who do that, who are successful in the field. There are a lot of people who are successful in the field who don't do that. Does that make sense? It's not like one-to-one.
How did you feel about people like Ed Snowden or WikiLeaks? And were you working during the time when a lot of that kind of happened?
Yeah. So so what I was saying earlier was I left MITRE around the same time that those came out, and I had already decided to leave. I didn't like leave only because of that, but I did see things that like concerned me a little bit, but I was like a junior engineer, so there was only so much that like I could know or have control over. The only thing that I think was there are people who debate like whether Edward Snowden should have released like as much as he did at the beginning. And I think that there is something to the argument that there were things that were released that basically put military especially at risk, and put soldiers at risk, and I think that's something to consider. But I think the overall effect of what he did was really important because it kind of let people know a lot of what was happening and a lot of things that government employees even didn't know was happening. So I think that it's very tricky. Like I think there were pros and cons to what he did. I think probably in kind of the longer term, it was a good thing. But I'd argue that maybe there are ways that some of the ways that he released information were a little bit irresponsible, is what some people would say. And then you said something about what, like, I think the same thing applies to WikiLeaks. Yeah.
And then before that, you worked at the NSA, like, kind of some of the, like, were you more protecting it, kind of like encrypting the NSA, or like, or did you do any of the kind of like tapping and stuff?
No, so I personally did not do any tacting, and like I said, what we were doing was defensive. So what we were really focused on was not like hacking anyone else, and certainly not hacking U.S. citizens. What's interesting is like NSA is a huge organization, and there were people that I was talking to there who like wouldn't have known that any of this stuff was happening. We kind of think about the government being like really coordinated, and they're really not. Honestly, we were like an independent contractor, and so we would sometimes we were like, oh, did you guys know that someone else at the NSA is working on the same thing, and you guys should probably talk to each other? Like and especially when you're talking about agencies talking to other agencies, like there's a lot of disconnect, which is another whole other problem I won't go into right now. But basically, what we were doing was working on like how to defend from other hackers. So no, we didn't do any of that at MITRE. There's a lot coming up. Yeah, I'm gonna go with you. Yeah.
As a woman entering this sort of field, did you face any discrimination? And if so, how did you overcome it?
That's a good question. So I very rarely face really outright discrimination. I have faced outright discrimination. I have had people ask like, oh, I didn't think that girls did this, or I didn't think that girls could do this, which is just sort of like an idiotic thing to say. I think more of what I experienced was I would realize that there were moments when I realized my boss wasn't taking me as seriously as like another guy I worked with who like we had the same level of experience and we're doing the same level of work on projects, and he wouldn't add me to new projects. And basically I had to go and kind of say like, hey, these are my ambitions, this is what I want to do, and I had to be super clear about it. And after kind of fighting for that a little bit, I was able to like get on the projects I wanted to. I think like there was a little bit of a little bit of a wake up call there. But fortunately, I think I haven't experienced much like very direct discrimination. But there's a lot of these sort of like indirect things that are make it a little trickier to deal with.
Based on what happened during the election, do you think Hillary Clinton was in the right or in the wrong with her private email server?
It's a very tricky one because it is something that other secretaries of state had done before. I think that from my experience, like when I was working at MITRE, it was like, you had to go through several layers of security to like get to your email if you were at home, and a lot of things I couldn't even access when I was at home. So I was used to like needing to be super secure in everything I did. So Without getting into a very political discussion, what I'll say is that I think that it would have been better if she didn't have it, but there were people who had done it before too, so I think it was potentially a little unfair, but I think it would be better if everyone was using like the State Department email server. Yeah.
How do you think we should have handled the Russian hacking of the DNC server and John Test's email?
And John Test's email. Yeah, so like I think this is an example of things that can be like the effects that you can have when you have poor security. So what happened to John Podesta was what's called like a phishing or spear phishing attempt, right? And that, we would see that happen at a lot of organizations that we were working with, and some of the things that we were doing was try like how to develop technology to detect that stuff before it happens. So I think the learning to me is that, and again, this could have happened to any party and any person. I think that the learning is that if we don't want these things to happen, we need to really have better research into like how to protect against that. It looks like you have another question. Yeah.
Do you think that the government should hold Russia accountable for it?
Should hold Russia accountable?
Yeah.
Yes, I do, and I think if they had, there's some evidence that they may have done this to RNC as well. They should also be accountable for that. So. I think there does need to be accountability for all of this, but like I was saying earlier, like what those rules are unclear right now because it's like the technology and the hacking and stuff is going faster than we have like international norms for this, and there's no precedent, right? Like it's the first time we've ever had this. So yes, I think there does need to be some kind of accountability and some kind of like international accountability. I think like if there are people the U.S. has done some of that hacking, they should also be held accountable for that. But what exactly it should be and how exactly to design it, I think it's really complicated. And hopefully there'll be smart people who like really know politics, international relations, and security who can help answer that question. Yeah. You and then yeah.
Would you recommend any change, like to implement any changes in high school courses to help women, like to help teenage girls want to join the tech career course? And what would you recommend for Blair?
So I would love to hear more about your courses afterwards. Like I don't know them in detail enough to say. An important thing that like we say at Girls Who Code is like I don't think that there's a special way to teach girls. I think teaching in a gender inclusive way is a good way for everyone to learn. Like I had other guy friends in some of my courses who also hadn't been doing like the hacking at home for years, and this was new to them, and they didn't really feel like they were part of it either. So I think that part of what good ways for everyone to learn are to really focus in on using like how to use computer science as a way to solve problems you care about. That's the approach that we take at Girls Who Code, and I think that that's something that could be applied to a co-ed classroom just as easily. So how like when I was taking computer science courses, like my one-on-one class, there were sort of silly problems sometimes, like how to let's make and I really hope that you guys will have this project in class. How to I need to write a program that will check whether or not a word is a palindrome. Like that's kind of like a common CS 101 project. Why would anyone ever do that? Like there's no purpose to that program. It doesn't it kind of lives in a vacuum. And so I think that things that live less in a vacuum and are really applied are actually the best ways for everyone to learn, and it kind of helps even the playing field for people who haven't had exposure beforehand or don't know a lot of the lingo. And so I think that helps make the class more fair and interesting across the board for people of all different backgrounds and all genders. Yes, in the green pack.
What is your opinion on applications such as the Onion Root or Bitcoin?
So my opinion on whether they're good tools, whether or not they're good tools or good to
just
have.
in general, whether the pros and cons of the Onion Root and whether it could be used for any type of advancement or if it's just kind of like an underground kind of thing.
Yeah. So for folks who may not know, the Tor project, for example, is using something called onion routing. which is basically a way, this is actually how Edward Snowden shared some of his information to Julian Assange, I believe he used like Tor to share that. Or actually how now Chelsea Manning shared that information with him. So I think basically, I think that it's an important tool, undergrounding. It's used by, I think one of the best uses of it is in countries, like for example, countries that are in civil war, it's used by journalists to get information securely from their sources without divulging those sources and putting those sources at risk. So I think for journalists especially, it's an extremely important tool. The problem with something like Tor is that about, like it's hard to get the numbers at this, but like I've seen estimates like between 60 and 90% of, or maybe even higher, is used for child pornography. And so the thing about Tor especially, and why that matters, is that Tor becomes more secure and more secretive the more people use it. So the people using it for positive reasons, I think for like the journalists who are using it, their secrecy is benefiting from the amount of child pornography that's being used on Tor, being done on Tor. So I think like it's tricky. You know, would those things be happening without Tor? Yes, but a lot less of it because it would be a lot harder to do. And then your other question was about Bitcoin.
Yeah, just in general.
Yeah, so I think like Bitcoin's also interesting. Like I think this this question about privacy is really interesting, and I think it's it's allowed people to be able to make exchanges and exchange money in a private way. But it's also used in parts of the deep web on Tor to like buy illegal weapons and to things like that. So like I don't know, it's tricky. I think it's not purely good or bad. I don't think that we can put it into like a black or white category like that. In general, I think like I don't really believe in like stopping innovation and saying like no, don't do any of that stuff. I think we should do it and figure out, like, get more smart people involved and figure out how to do it in a more ethical and productive way.
You talk a lot about the interdisciplinary between computer science and politics.
Yeah.
Is there any room in the workforce or in general for interdisciplinary between computer science and art?
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. So one of the organizations that we work with is a company you all might have heard of called Pixar. There's a really amazing woman there who's their director of photography, and she did computer science at Harvard and like worked in engineering for a while, and then got involved in like the engineering side of design and video and film. And the technology at Pixar is like really fascinating. Like has anyone seen Brave, like Merida? She had like this like crazy curly hair. This woman, Danielle Feinberg, so I would recommend checking out, like for anyone, I would recommend checking out Danielle Feinberg's talks. She's like, has like TED Talks and stuff, and she's really incredible. They took them 3 years to develop the technology for Merida that creates Merida's hair. Like just her hair. So like that there's like there's tons of stuff kind of combining art and computer science, and like it's one of those things that like traditionally is like looked at like a left and right brain thing, and I think it's not it's just not that straightforward. Like it's just integrated in everything we do. So yes, that's just one example. Yes, in the back.
I was wondering if you were working with the government during the whole San Bernardino bombing and with the Apple, kind of that and iPhone, like how they're kind of doing that. I was wondering what that was like for the government.
Yeah, that was actually when I was in graduate school, so I wasn't there at the time. But I think like it's kind of back to that privacy conversation. Like it was one of those things where the laws have not kept up with where the technology is now, and we really need better legal guidance on how to like do that ethically. So I think I think it would have been. I'm sure there would have been like a lot of debate there about like what the government should be able to do. There's a really interesting podcast about this, about kind of the Fourth Amendment and privacy and what that means today. If anyone listens to the podcast Note to Self. It's really, really good, and they had one a couple weeks ago on like the Fourth Amendment and what that means in tech. So if you're interested in this, I would check that out. Any other questions? Yes.
How was Girls Code funded originally, initially,
Yeah.
and has that changed, that type of funding changed over the course as you grow?
That's a really good question. So I found it kind of, Girls That Code has an interesting model that's different than a lot of other nonprofits. I mean, and we're one of the biggest nonprofits in this space because we've just grown really quickly. The funding model at the beginning was basically to have tech companies fund these summer immersion programs, and they host the summer immersion programs in their offices. So AppNexus, which is like an ad trading platform company, where our offices still are now, they sponsored the first one. But by the next year, we had Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, a lot of these big tech companies. So those were kind of the primary funders from the beginning. And basically, sometimes it would come from usually one of 2 or 3 places. Sometimes it would be, a lot of these big companies have what are called corporate social responsibility offices, where they kind of manage their charitable giving, so sometimes it came out of there. Sometimes it would come out of like the CTO or the tech department, because what they were trying to do is they had like Google's numbers and they were trying to recruit more women, and their hope was that these girls would like intern and then eventually come work for the organizations. So those were the primary kind of source of revenue for Girls With Code from the beginning. What's been kind of interesting is that like we've worked with a lot of different organizations in the last couple of years who like were funded by like Sephora. And like it's interesting because now about 2/3 of, that's just one of like 80 of them, but I use that example because you wouldn't think of that. But they have a huge online store, they have an app, they have a humongous tech team. So they're interested in this as well, and a lot of people are kind of out there saying every company is a tech company now. And about 2/3, this is the most recent stat I heard about this, was that about 2/3 of tech jobs are actually in the non-tech sector. So it's like these companies that have more of a general product, but they still need a lot of coders and programmers and computer scientists. So that's diversified a bit. The only thing though is that we basically in the last year or two we've really been trying to focus in on other sources of revenue, and so this year we're going to be having like our first. All these programs are free. We're going to be having our first like paid program, and then some of it comes from like individuals and foundations, but foundations need about usually 10 years of longitudinal data, and we're only 5 years old.
I think if you'd like to ask more questions, come on down.
Yeah.
We want to thank Emily Reid for coming out from New York City today. Also, when we measure the success of any evening, it's usually by the questions asked, a wonderful array of questions. And lastly, note that people who code and people who stay behind computers also seem to communicate very well. Thank you.
Thank you.